the DigiPodcast, Digital Trends in Supply Chain Management.
Hello and welcome to our DigiPodcast. I'm Thomas Holzner from Siemens SCM DigiNetwork with the DigiPodcast, a podcast on digital and innovative topics for procurement in the future. Digitalization is becoming increasingly important for every company. At Siemens in particular, digitalization is a fundamental element for success. But how is digitalization practiced at Siemens Supply Chain Management? What do we focus on? The aspect of digital transformation and innovation is particularly close to our hearts. In our podcast, we highlight different aspects and share best practices with various digital experts and listen to their stories. Every one of us buys at the supermarket several times a week things for our daily needs. Do you know these special buy free, pay two? They're very appealing to many people because you can save money. I've also taken advantage of this several times, but both as a private person and also as a former CPO at Siemens. So this means bundled products are not only available in supermarkets. A huge company like Siemens bundles a big portion of the purchasing volume globally, where a lot of units are involved and benefiting from. And I'm aware this is a monster challenge regarding flexibility, complexity and management. I have the pleasure to have Robert Suchy as my guest today. He is the guy who is taming the monster quite successfully as head of pooling categories. Robert, was my introduction reasonably correct?
It was, Thomas. Hi, it's my pleasure to be here in the podcast today. Well, actually, it's not me alone taming the monster. It is 8 teams consisting of many corporate and business colleagues.
Okay, but you're the main contact when it comes to pooled materials and services. So what does pooling actually mean and why is it done?
Quite simple. Pooling basically means the whole is more than just the sum of all parts. Or in other words, size really matters on all supply markets.
That's interesting because I hear also other things like the fastest, the best adapting. So quite exciting. Can we start talking about this?
Of course we can. But Thomas, before we get into the details, let me ask you a question. How long do you think is Siemens already pooling?
Minimum since 1998, because that was the time when I came back to Siemens, and I assume that was not the first step, so I would say in the 60s, and I'm totally convinced that it's steel, because steel is easy.
Almost right. In the early 20s of the last century it started, and the focus in those days was specifically on iron ore. Basically, this clearly shows we have come quite a long way as Siemens with pooling activities, haven't we?
Oh, sounds then like an evergreen, so what does this whole thing look today? And maybe what are you pooling?
Well, it looks much different compared to the old days, of course. Today we are sourcing different materials and services, and we do it in a very different way. We only pool if there is a demand across business units. Plus, we only pool if the units see a significant benefit by pooling and joint negotiating these demands. Obviously, this is the case because Thomas, literally all carved out Siemens affiliates have asked us to sign service agreements with us. A nice proof of concept, isn't it? And what do you think? Why they signed these service agreements? Simply because they see a clear value add. And this value add is sometimes best terms and conditions, and sometimes, like the times we are in right now, unfortunately, it is all about availability of material and services.
I'm aware regarding the past, but looking forward in the future, I have a huge demand of ice cream. So as the SCM DigiNetwork is also a part of the SCM network, how can I pool now my ice cream?
Well, ice cream is a little bit challenging. We don't have that in our pooling scope, but almost anything else. So it's quite a broad scope from indirect materials like IT, travel, consulting, all the way to direct material like steel, like plastics, electromechanics and electronics.
Okay, so nearly everything. But are there now, or I'm convinced there are, because of this pandemic and also the impact of the other things that are coming around, what are the changes or the new challenges you have, and how did this support or did it hinder the importance of pooling for Siemens?
Well, actually, the pandemic has changed a lot. Number one, the way we work is very different to the old times. All meetings today, including negotiations with our suppliers, are solely conducted virtually. Number two, the pandemic, of course, also had its impact on the global supply chains. It really has become very challenging on the supply markets these days. And unfortunately, one challenge never comes alone. In addition to the pandemic, we're facing now challenges that demand is today much higher than supply. And if this would not be enough, Mother Nature also is striking back. Think of the current floodings in Europe or the typhoon that just recently hit the Shanghai area.
Quite big changes. And before I come back to my favorite topic, digitalization, because here I'm totally aware what you're doing. If you reduce now here travel because you do online virtually, what else are you doing to improve sustainability? Because that's becoming more and more important. As you just mentioned, the floods, and you have the biggest responsibility regarding purchasing volume within our network.
The first point you already mentioned, we will never ever come back to the old times where we had many business trips. So also after the pandemic, a huge part of our work will be certainly done virtually. We call that the new normal kind of working. Secondly, the CO2 reduction will be a decisive sourcing criteria for choosing the right suppliers in the future. This is why we started carbon web assessments. Based on the carbon web assessments, we get the transparency on the CO2 footprint of our suppliers in the supply chain. Plus, we then can measure improvement steps with regards to CO2 reduction. And last but not least, we started sharing best practices on a platform around smart, sustainable solutions across commodities and regions. An initiative kicked off by our colleagues in the regions.
Bad times for airlines. And what's totally interesting, this decisive criteria for choosing a supplier based on CO2. I think a lot of companies have to readjust. But I think in 1 year, maybe we could talk about how did this comparison factor for total cost change. Because I would like now come back to my most important topic personally, this digitalization area. And here I can spoil a little bit. Robert's unit is for me one of the front runners regarding digitalization. Regarding this virtual collaboration, we implemented the pilots and all the follow-ups together with his unit to do negotiations and collaboration fully virtual in 3D with avatars with a positive feedback from the suppliers. We have also artificial intelligence, and here a lot of people are talking about, but I'm aware you're doing it. So what has changed in your classic pooling approach?
Well, almost everything, Thomas. You have mentioned the way we negotiate with avatars, and you just named one example. A second one would be that we, in the meantime, have established quite some platforms to allow our cross functions and users to have all information on hand. And you also touched on artificial intelligence. In selected commodities, we've started using artificial intelligence. Yeah, well, maybe I just name one example. In our category logistics, we use the logo stands for logistics bot. And this little machine colleague is actually taking over part of our procurement processes like price comparison of bids, all the way to proposing then at the end and the best offer to the buyer. So really a huge help for our commodity managers who then can place the order based on the recommendation, but of course up to them, but they still have all available data on hand presented by the artificial intelligence. And this digitalization journey will continue, and it already is actually be the new normal for us and for our teams and also for our internal customers.
It sounds great because you reduce administrative work that the people can focus on strategic work. And I know that you have a lot of other things like the Magic Cube or the Payment Navigator where we talked already a lot. But here we could talk for hours, and then I couldn't come to my last but not least and most important question. Who is Robert Suchy personally?
Well, I'm a family man, and I'm a person that loves traveling and meeting people very much, and saying that I'm, of course, suffering quite a bit these days due to COVID-19. And last but not least, and Thomas, you know that, I'm a car maniac.
Yeah, with some classical cars and evergreens at the back of my mind. What I really can confirm, you're not only a family man, you're a very social person, because when I think about the teams, they loved you. I was a part of your team 2 times, and you're a really great leader. So thanks a lot, Robert. I hope our listeners enjoyed our episode of this DigiPodcast. If you have questions or want to find out more about Robert, pooling, or about the Siemens DigiNetwork, reach out to us or to our internet page siemens.com/diginetwork. I'm looking forward having you as a listener at our next episode. Yours, Thomas Holzner from the Siemens SCM DigiNetwork. Goodbye.
The DigiPodcast, Digital Trends in Supply Chain Management.